Okay, the recording is working, Denny. You can go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So good morning, everybody. Let me welcome to this webinar. My name is Den Jobin. I'm Senior Evaluation Specialist from the Evaluation Office and leading this global evaluation that we did in 2023 and finalized last year, end of last year. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It's my privilege to welcome you to this webinar where we will explore UNICEF effort in addressing child poverty through evidence-based advocacy, social protection, and strategic public finance engagement. As we come together, let us remind ourselves of the scale of the challenge that we face. Nearly 333 million children live in extreme poverty. 1 billion face multidimensional poverty globally, meaning they lack necessities such as food, water, shelter. Among shelter, 350, 500 million children live in slum. It's expected 1.2 million will be 1.2 billion will be projected by 2050 living in slum. About shelter, then education and healthcare. The evaluation was conducted in 2023, the data collection mainly, and finalized last quarter of 2024 last year. It was a big exercise. We have a country sample, more than 24 countries, with a focus on 4 of them with an in-depth analysis: Cambodia, Colombia, Rwanda, and Sri Lanka. But there were more than 24 countries, and we invite some today. UNICEF evaluation revealed the profound impact of linking poverty measurement, advocacy, service delivery, including through social protection. Success story from Montenegro, Panama will be discussed today, and Rwanda that was picked up as well through our evaluative work. I'm going to share a bit, demonstrating how evidence-based approach are catalyzing change. In Montenegro, advocacy grounded in robust evidence led the adoption of universal child allowance, reducing child poverty rate to their lowest level in over a decade. In Panama, UNICEF work on multinational poverty measurement was pivotal. Through partnership with national stakeholders, poverty data identified the most vulnerable districts and guide targeted social protection policies and intervention. By integrating these insights into the national planning process, Panama has demonstrated how accurate data can improve resource allocation, policy design, reducing inequalities in indigenous and rural community as well. In Rwanda, which is reflected in the good practice note, UNICEF collaboration with the National Institute of Statistics exemplifies how capacity building can lead to sustainable government-led initiative. The integration of child poverty measure into Rwanda National Household Survey enabled the development of a comprehensive child poverty report. These reports directly inform government budgeting priorities, leading to an increased allocation to critical social sector like health, education, social protection. Between 2013-18, spending in the social protection sector rose by 32% in Rwanda, illustrating how robust poverty measurement can drive equitable solution and resource allocation. What is at stake for UNICEF? Our colleague from the Global Desk here will discuss and share some of their insight here, but for the region highlight in this webinar, Latin America and the Caribbean and ECAR, Europe and Central Asia region, there are some big issues at stake. For the LACRO, Latin America and the Caribbean, the region faces a dual challenge of high economic inequalities and increased vulnerability due to impact of climate change and migration crisis among many. In countries like Panama, multidimensional poverty disproportionately affect indigenous and rural communities, highlight the need for targeted evidence-based social protection programs, so connecting the measurement and the poverty with service delivery. UNICEF advocacy in the region must focus on integrating poverty data into the policy framework that address these inequalities and building government capacity to expand fiscal space analysis for children. A key priority should ensuring public finance for children that align with resilience building strategies in fragile and climate affected area at the center of the poverty work, in my view. In ECAR, Europe and Central Asia, economic volatility, democratic transition, and political shift create significant challenge for sustainable child-focused investment. Countries like Montenegro have shown success in adopting universal child benefit through strong advocacy partnership, especially with the parliamentarian and legislative authority. Where the context allow, UNICEF Global need to move from a resource-heavy implementation role to models where focused knowledge and technical assistance. This change require a reconsider our business model, something that is actually going on at the global level to review and rethink our business model and approach. The nexus, social protection, public finance, government engagement is the cornerstone of sustainable poverty reduction. Evidence from this evaluation show that accurate data on child poverty is a game changer, is enabling government to prioritize intervention and their budget allocation and policies. Social protection system must evolve to integrate more poverty data, expanding coverage while addressing multi-dimensional vulnerabilities. And last but not least, aligning national budget with child-focused priorities ensure that investments are not only responsive, but also sustainable. The stance fiscal space studies, expenditure review, and impact evaluation have been tremendously helpful in advocating and supporting for this alignment. As we learn from our global evaluation exercise, we are pointing out a few enduring questions for UNICEF that will be touched in this webinar. First, how can UNICEF strengthen its advisory role in shaping comprehensive policy package across sector? What strategy will ensure that government institutionalize poverty measurement, making it pillar of policy and budget process nationally and subnationally? And finally, how do we keep child poverty reduction central to the global agenda amidst competing priorities with development partners? By leveraging evidence and conducting this important global evaluation, we can better position UNICEF, I hope, in fostering partnership and advocating for equity, turning tide on child poverty. So let me introduce you the distinguished speaker today and panelists. Hopefully, I don't know if Monica joined, but I will introduce you. Yes, Monica. So Monica Rubio, she's Regional Social Policy Advisor, UNICEF Latin American Caribbean Region Office. Hello, Monica, glad that you made it. Then Irena Jokic-Bozovic, Social Policy Officer, UNICEF Montenegro. And then Annie Lena Meya, I hope your name is okay. Monitoring and Evaluation Officer, UNICEF Panama Country Office. And Mr. Enrique de la Monica, Senior Advisor, Child Poverty, UNICEF Statistics, DAPAM, New York. Miss Jennifer Yablonsky, Social Manager, Social Protection Specialist, UNICEF. I hope I get your title correct. Michael, and the last and not least, Michael Samsung, work with me on this global evaluation, Director of Research Economic Policy Research Institute, which is based in Cape Town, South Africa. So we are honored to have you guys around with us and all the participants as well. Let us now begin the first session with Enrique de la Monica, and we're going to have a Q&A with all the participants that you can ask your question through the chat or now as you see fit, or later there's a 20-minute session. So thank you, everybody, and look forward for a very useful and rich discussion. Over to you, Enrique.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you very much. Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you also, Michael and Danny, for inviting me for this presentation. I need to apologize because I won't be able to stay all the way until past. I'm trying to see. Okay, there it works. So today I want to answer 3 questions as per the agenda about harmonization of child poverty measurement, the role the global coalition can play in addressing issues of policy and programming, and how to ensure that poverty is measured. So let me talk first about this issue of consistency across countries. It's important to remember we want to measure the 2 aspects of children in poverty: children in monetary poor households, which is the monetary metric, and multidimensional poverty, which is the experience of poverty that children suffer themselves directly. Now, when we say that we want consistency across countries, it does not mean that we have the same metric across countries, because that would lead to the paradox of precision. We measure exactly the same thing, but it's not relevant for policymaking in any individual country, like the dollar a day, for example. Now, although it's not the same metric, we should be measuring the same concept, the same thing. And that thing that we should measure is child poverty, which is different from a child rights index, which is different from an index of UNICEF interventions. We want to measure poverty with valid indicators of poverty, meaning of material deprivations. So we should use national poverty lines, and we should use country level thresholds of material needs. Now, there is another issue of harmonization in doing this, which is about methodology. It is done. This harmonization already exists. There is a document with UNDP, the World Bank, and UNICEF, which very clearly shows through the steps there are basically two things you need to do when you measure multidimensional poverty. You check deprivation for each individual or each household across various dimensions, and then you identify and count those that are counted as deprived. It's very simple, it's very straightforward. Everybody does the same thing. Now, although unfortunately I cannot see your faces, I imagine some of you are scratching their heads saying, hold on a second, isn't there a conflict between MODA and MPI? Which one should we use, MODA or MPI? So let me start by saying that these two things are the same methodology. I know you don't believe me, because you know the global MPI, you know the CC MODA, and they have different indicators. I want to invite you for an exercise, a hypothetical exercise. Let's say that we have a measure, an MPI, which has exactly 7 dimensions, or a MODA that have exactly the same dimensions, and they are exactly the same dimensions. Of course, neither of these would be the global MPI or the CC MODA. It would be a national one. And let's assume that we have in each dimension only one indicator, and it's the same indicator in each dimension, and we use the same thresholds to assess deprivation of that indicator of that dimension. Now, assume that we do this with equal weights, which is what is usually done in MODA. These two things would be exactly the same. They would be exactly the same. There is no difference in method. The difference is in the practical decision of number of dimensions or indicators or thresholds, or whether we weight or we don't. But none of these are mandated by the method. It's not a methodological issue, it's a practical issue. We do not have to engage in a conflict of whether we should MODA or MPI. That being said, some of these practical decisions could be done in a better way or in a not so good way. So if we have clarity on the conceptual definition, and we have clarity, for example, that all rights are equally valid, that immediately says when we measure child poverty, we should have equal rights, we should have equal weights across the dimensions, for example. And also in terms of which dimensions do we include? We do not include there in the measure of poverty dimensions which are either not valid measures of deprivation or which speak to the causes or the consequences of what we want to measure, because that would not be a good metric. Which takes me to the next question, which is this disconnect between the measurement and the policy. And frankly, I'm not sure what the disconnect is. What is this disconnect? I know that the question is often asked of me. I've been asked this many times at the country level. What can we use the measure of poverty for? And the answer is simple. We use the measure of child poverty to measure poverty. But what about policy making? Shouldn't the measure tell me what policies to engage in? Well, let's look at under 5 mortality. This is how we measure under 5 mortality. Please don't ask me to explain this to you, because I can't. It's a very convoluted way to measure under 5 mortality. It includes all the children born to the woman, the children that were dead. There are some model life tables. What is not included in the measure, is everything that we know helps to reduce under 5 mortality. Nutrition, mother's education, ORS, WASH, income of the parents. None of this is part of the measure. What we need and what we have is a model that says, how do these elements affect mortality, which we measure this way? Now, I know this is complicated, so let's go to something that most of us are more familiar with, which is economic growth, GDP. We know how to measure GDP. It's just the sum of the prices times the quantities of every good and service in the economy. It's a much simpler formula, What is not included? Everything that we know helps with economic growth through industrial policy, taxation, incentives, and investment in research and development. The formula doesn't tell us what to do. We need a model. We have a model of what are the things that influence and drive and determine child poverty, but that's not the remit I was asked to do today. I was asked to talk about measurement. But if we want better policy and if we want better models, then we need to have better data and better measurement. And one thing that I want to talk about now for a minute or two is that we have this experience of having 20, 30, 50 experts sitting around the table for a day or two or an afternoon and deciding the measure. That is not a good way of deciding the valid indicators of child poverty. We also do focus groups, and we ask 100 persons divided in 10 groups. Not good enough. We have a more appropriate and statistically valid set of questions that we can ask, so we can ask people, is this what your child needs? Does every child have this? Does your child have it? Why doesn't your child enjoy this particular element to fulfill their rights constitutive of poverty? That's called the consensual or the socially perceived needs approach. It has been applied, and because I've been asked also to talk a little bit about humanitarian context, I can tell you this socially perceived needs approach was used in Uganda nationally in the household survey run by the NSO, and then the same questions were asked in refugees community. Uganda at the time, this is a little of an old exercise, but at the time Uganda was one of the countries with the most refugees in proportion to their population. So we could compare the rate of child poverty among refugees and in host communities and in the rest of the country. It has also been used, for example, in Tonga, where there was an estimate of child poverty using the consensus approach or socially perceived needs approach. That was, the questions were in the census. We could do small area estimates. We have a very, very good map of child poverty. And it was done, kind of fortuitously, a little bit before a big, big natural disaster. The mapping allowed us to see where the risks were, which were the areas in the country that were most prone to be hit by a cyclone or a storm or something, but also where poverty was higher. And the same questions, together with additional questions, were used in the post-disaster assessment, and it allowed to channel the investments for reconstruction where they were needed most. So this is another way that the poverty measure could be used. Now, how can UNICEF and others collaborate to ensure that we have the financial wherewithal to measure child poverty globally? I would posit the financial constraint is not the big one. There are 4 constraints. The first constraint addresses why. Why do we want to measure this? And it's lack of understanding among colleagues, including in UNICEF, but also in governments, of why child poverty is different from household or adult poverty. Then there is a constraint of the how. How do we measure this? How do we need to still explain how to estimate child poverty differently from adults. The third constraint is, who is going to do this? Well, it needs to be institutionalized in National Statistical Office. We cannot engage in something which is sustainable if every time we want to measure child poverty, we need to hire a consultant. This needs to be owned by the countries, and they need to report on this regularly whenever they have a household survey. And this addresses the how much question. This is the final constraint, the financial one. The cost is minimal if it's done by the NSO when they estimate poverty whenever they do it, when they have a survey, because it's just basically a few more lines of syntax that they should do. And the work we do in the data and analytics section in terms of helping countries have a minimum data package for children and child-centered surveys like MIX would go a long way to help to institutionalize this measure. And that's what we're engaged in. And thank you very, very much for your attention. I hope you have a lot of questions for me.
Yeah, the question. Thank you. Do share your PowerPoint. We're a bit 1 minute late, so let's move now to our next speaker, please. Thank you, Enrique. That was very interesting. Jennifer, please, over to you.
Jennifer, you're on mute.
Sorry, thanks, Danny and Enrique. 1 second, I'm just working on the sharing. 1 second. So
usually,
you see a presentation, or you see?
Usually,
Sorry?
is it at the bottom? Usually, you click on the bottom. There's a below.
Yeah.
I don't see it. Yeah.
1 second. Sorry about that. Sorry, you see my screen, or you do not?
Yes, we see.
Did you see it in the middle of the presentation?
Yeah, we see. See the outline too. Well, go ahead.
Oh no. Apologies, colleagues. Maybe while I'm doing that, to be honest, I hesitated about whether to give a presentation at all, because I think sometimes we get very focused on the slides. But
if Anu has it, we can. She can share it. I don't know if you send it to us.
No, I don't have the presentation then.
Yeah, let's go do it again.
Yeah, for the interest of time, let's just get started. Sorry that you see the notes, but there's not a lot of detail there. What I was asked to speak today about was really looking a little bit more at thinking about child poverty advocacy and how are we effective in that work. And it's really a reflection from UNICEF's experience in doing so. And I wanted to sort of maybe share a little bit of experience and provoke us to think about a few things. But maybe just starting with where we are in terms of our collective commitments. I know everybody on the call knows this, but I think important just to remind ourselves, right, that we both have commitments around ending child poverty from a child rights perspective, from the perspective of the SDGs, as well as UNICEF has specific commitments under our current strategic plan and will actually in the upcoming forthcoming strategic plan around ending child poverty. And then thinking about where are we in relation to that commitment. And I'm sure many of you have seen some of these figures before, but just to remind us, right, that when you think about from a multidimensional poverty perspective, as Enrique was saying, and I think probably the more important figure here, we're talking about 1 billion children in multidimensional poverty. And then when you look at extreme poverty from a monetary measure, the number is about over 300 million children. I think in some ways, more than the sort of top line numbers, I think really concerning us has been the fact that we're actually slowing down in making progress on reducing child poverty, right? Both because of lost progress due to the pandemic, but even post-pandemic so far, the rate of poverty reduction has barely been flatlining. And this both comes from kind of some of our numbers, as well as if you look at more broadly, some of the, for example, the World Bank's messages about what's happening on poverty globally. Obviously, there's a lot of diversity, right, by region and by specific country. So I don't want to sort of paint only sort of a bleak picture, but I think it's important to think about if we, our end goal is really about ending child poverty, we're actually slowing down and making progress towards that goal. And this slide, what I really just wanted to highlight was actually the graph on the right, which comes from the work led by Inocente on the report card, and particularly looking at high-income countries. And what you see in this graph on the top, right, are countries that, in the time period measured have made significant progress in reducing child poverty, particularly those in the green. And over the same period, if you go lower down in the graph, countries that have made much less progress and actually in some cases have seen increased rates of child poverty. And I think the key message here that we want to underline is that kind of what was headlined at the beginning of my presentation is that even within the same time frame, country governments have made very different choices from a policy perspective in addressing child poverty. And we see this in the analysis, for example, in that report card, as well as from other countries, that policy choices make a huge difference in terms of what happens in reducing child poverty. That is not simply an inevitability, which I don't think many people on this call would think, but I think when you think about the narrative that is often out there, both Enrique's point that often it's just seen as tied to household poverty, but also the sense of, most people probably would not see child poverty as a negative thing, but may see that as sort of something that may be inevitable or something that policy can't really change. And this is a bit the more provocative piece about our reflection and links into some of the things that Enrique was saying before. UNICEF has a long history and a really important history around child poverty measurement. And I think we're not the only ones, but I think has played a critical role in getting children onto the agenda and also thinking about the way in which we measure and understand child poverty, right? Starting from, as I'm sure goes further back, but for example, kind of in 2000, really highlighting the importance of multidimensional child poverty. And this pathway, through up until now, right? So almost 25 years of really highlighting child poverty from a regional perspective. There's many, they're not all listed here, many country reports really looking at the specific dimensions of multidimensional child poverty, as well as understanding, for example, the interaction between monetary poverty and multidimensional poverty for children. But I think moving on to thinking about advocacy and thinking about policy change, this slide this is an internal data slide, right? Really looking at where countries where UNICEF is working and where that measurement or analysis has been used to influence policies and programs specifically to reduce child poverty. And while we have seen over the past couple of years an increase, for example, in the number of countries that are doing that type of work, it's still pretty modest. And a lot more of the bulk of our kind of child poverty work has really been focused on, measurement, communicating those measurements, et cetera. And this is not in any way to undermine the importance of that work as a baseline, as Enrique said, right? That's not the point. But to think about how do we then make that move into actually creating change in children's lives? And what is it that we need to do to make that transition? To be honest, I'm much more looking forward to kind of hearing from some of the country examples of the successes in doing so. But I think we wanted to mention a couple of things that we have been looking at from more of a global perspective, right? And how do we build on all of this strength from child poverty measurement to really influence policy action and ultimately kind of have an impact on child poverty rates? And what do we need to do to get there? That's a very complex question. I'm not going to cover all of that now. And, one thing we always emphasize is that real change obviously is going to happen at national level. But I think from a global perspective, what are the kinds of things that can help support, create a more enabling environment for that change at national level? And one thing that we did basically last year, Sola's on this call, they're not speaking, and she really sort of drove this forward, was to develop a global advocacy strategy to try to move the needle, being much more explicit about who are we trying to influence and how, who can actually make a difference from a global or regional perspective in child poverty policy. And then I think touching on a point that came out, for example, from the child poverty evaluation, how do we develop messages that can be adapted to different audiences and understanding different political sensitivity so that we may have a global message, but the importance of allowing that contextualization of those messages and sensitivities. I think a key piece, which to be honest, has been going on for a long time, but we are kind of looking to continue to strengthen is really about how do we work with allies and coalitions. And there's something I wanted to highlight here, which is I think there are two pieces to this, right? How, I think many people are familiar with the Global Coalition to End Child Poverty, which has quite diverse stakeholders, including research institutions, including civil society, including other agencies in that coalition. And highlighting child poverty as an advocacy item in itself, but also the importance of working with existing coalitions or supporting others in their work. So for example, even under the Coalition to End Child Poverty, ATD Fourth World, which really is a representative group of people living in poverty, has their own events, and there's a number of those that we have supported and sort of brought children's voices into those events. Or the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty and Hunger, which was formed under Brazil's G20 presidency last year. UNICEF was very active in basically the formation of that, but really positioning child poverty and the relevant policy solutions within that. So it's this combination of trying to understand how do we build coalitions that are focused on child poverty itself, but also how do we support existing kind of initiatives that have and can reach broader audiences to have to get those messages into diverse decision-making points and really understanding and supporting the momentum of other initiatives also. An additional area which has been, I think, certainly is ongoing at national level, but I think globally we've been trying to sort of start looking at more explicitly is what are the policy solutions that are effective and trying to build consensus around those policies. I think there's a number of them that which aren't particularly a secret. We know from some of the evidence. But still, I think we have planned additional analysis on countries that have been successful. We expect what are the kinds of policy choices that they have made and how has that had an impact on child poverty? Which links actually in some ways to the previous point, also identifying countries that are champions and can influence others. Presenting, in thinking about policies for solutions for children, presenting some of these more explicitly as effective in presenting that evidence and reaching different audiences with those messages. And something that we have planned for this year is kind of trying to set up some kind of global commission on ending child poverty, which is really less focused on the measurement, but what do we know and how do we build consensus around the policies that are effective in ending child poverty?
Thank you, Jen. 1 minute. Yeah.
No, this is my last slide actually. And then the last thing, which just being more explicit about this, how it then links to the measurement piece is that in trying to continue to kind of strategically use and communicate the data and analysis with partners, right? We produce great evidence and we've been pretty good, I think, in communicating that, but continuing to do that and thinking strategic about which partners help cascade those messages and represent UNICEF as, can leverage partnerships, right? So for example, with the Global Coalition and with World Bank producing joint publications on child poverty and on the policy solutions. Let me end there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jen. So thank you. So now we just heard Enrique and Jennifer on the global perspective, the measurement, and then how translate this measurement to global advocacy partnership and to promote the work of poverty. And I think it's going to be more central in the next UNICEF strategic plan. So let's go to our next speaker, Ms. Monica Rubio, Regional Social Policy Advisor, Panama Regional Office, covering Latin America and Caribbean region. Over to you, dear Monica. Welcome.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Dennis, thank you for having me. Maybe I'll start saying this from a regional perspective. I would like to highlight, the importance of this meeting and the importance of putting child poverty at the top of the social development agenda as a key role for UNICEF. Like Jen said, the most important things that happen at a country level, and as a regional office, however, we see a role mainly as one that intends to scale up efforts, of country offices in 4 key areas. One of them has to do with measurement, and Enrique, dwelt about it quite a bit. And the other areas have to do, number one, with providing policy advice and technical assistance to help governments to extend coverage and improve access to cash benefits or core services for poor and vulnerable children and their family. Second, by working to reinforce coordinations and links of social assistance, family care, and other essential services. And third, and related to measuring, to try to embed a culture of regular monitoring, evaluation, and research on child poverty. I was directed to answer 3 questions, and the first question has to do then first with how can regional offices support country teams in building capacities for measuring and addressing child poverty. Like I said, we see regional offices playing a critical role helping countries strengthen this technical capacity to measure and address child poverty effectively. Without accurate measurement, the foundation, for targeted policies and impactful programs, is just simply not there. So as UNICEF reality, as the whole of UNICEF, we can support countries in transitioning from income-based poverty measures to multidimensional approaches that can capture the full spectrum of the privations that children face. This includes training and national statistical offices, both in collecting data and on analyzing, poverty in different dimensions, but also working with, with governments to understand, to design comprehensive poverty indicators, that these measures can help. Countries like Mexico, for example, have demonstrated the value of these multidimensional frameworks, and UNICEF, can help replicate these successes globally. We do that at a regional level. A second point that we have to make sure, we support countries in has to do with building the institutionality, that allows us, to go beyond providing technical assistance, but moves the task more from UNICEF, to the national institutions. We have a couple of countries, Mexico and Argentina, that shine on this precisely, in which the building capacity required initially hands-on technical assistance, but after a while, the efforts, of measuring, of using information that informs policymaking is pretty much part, of the day-to-day, efforts of government officials and public servants. Another point that is important, I think, from a regional office perspective, has to do with how intentional we are in our work showcasing the evidence that work. That means promoting, both data use for policy and program design that is informed about all this evidence that we know works when it comes to addressing child poverty making. And in that, we work hand in hand, HQ, regional offices, and country offices, shedding light on what works. And I think in Latin America in particular, we are called to actually put the light on, say, for example, particular and specific deprivations in which we haven't done well as a region addressing. Say, for example, children with disabilities, indigenous children, who are most affected by poverty and at the same time require technical assistance that can tailor their interventions to meet their very unique needs. Other areas in which regional offices, support country offices have to do with partnerships, for knowledge exchange, in which we see our collaborations with country offices and as one that shares all the time best practices and lessons learned. We try to take advantage as much as we can of spaces in which peer-to-peer learning opportunities, such as workshops, webinars like this ones, allow our country office colleagues and governments to see how others have successfully institutionalized poverty measurement and implemented effective interventions. By the same token, I think, integrating poverty measurement into national planning, is an area in which we as, UNICEF officers, need to work towards. UNICEF can work with governments to embed child poverty measurement, into national development banks and plans and budgets. Finally, I think, and we have wonderful examples of this in our Argentina country office, engaging communities in data collection and advocacy, is a very effective way of making everybody care, about child poverty. UNICEF can empower communities to participate in data collection, or in the qualitative experience of, recording the qualitative experience on poverty, and use this in advocacy effort. By involving local organizations and families, data becomes alive, and policies can be better aligned with the real needs of community. It's a way to strengthen public awareness, to strengthen support, and to create a shared commitment towards tackling child poverty. If I may jump to the second question, Dennis, you will correct me, is what unique regional challenges, complicate child poverty reduction, and how can they be addressed? And I'm afraid the second part of the question, how can they be addressed, cannot be treated, with, reasonably within this very short time. So I'll just concentrate into the unique regional challenges. I think, in Latin America, we have all challenges, important challenges to deal with when it comes to poverty reduction. And they have to do with, a trend of low productivity, low growth, social contracts, that are not really very good about including families, and children. All these old challenges like, for example, the fragmentation of social protection systems and so forth, are right now being complicated, but new challenges. And I'll start, with what Jen was mentioning, post-pandemic recovery. COVID-19 pandemic left a devastating impact on children from the Latin American region. The school closures was among the largest school closures in the entire world. Additionally, we had job losses, economic downturns, that followed the pandemic. So as we move forward as a region, targeted education programs that actually try to make up for the deficits that we know exist, nutritional support, to families that now report hunger, in a region that didn't report that before, and robust social protection mechanisms are critical. But particularly we know about, the increase in prices of food and essential goods and
You're breaking. Is it me or you're breaking, Monica? But you're reaching the end?
No, we cannot hear Monica. I think we lost her.
You're breaking, Monica.
that has been combated for macroeconomic in some of our countries like Argentina and Venezuela that actually have exacerbated risk.
You're
I'm sorry?
breaking. You're breaking.
Okay.
We can't hear you.
Like other regions. I'm sorry.
We cannot hear you.
I think we lost her, Denny.
Okay, so thank you. So let's move. Sorry, maybe she got back for the Q&As, hopefully. Let's move to country level now, good practice. The next one is from Montenegro, Irena. After that, it's going to be Panama and Elena. And then we're going to have the Q&As. So be patient. So over to you, Irena. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I would just wait for Anu to share my screen.
Can you see Irena?
Thank you, Anu. It's okay now. So first of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak about amplifying adolescent voices and leveraging evidence to advocate for universal child allowance in Montenegro. Before I start answering two questions that I was allocated, I would like to explain a couple of points about child poverty in Montenegro, that is about the transition from vulnerability targeted to universal child allowance in the country. Next slide, Anu. The poverty had long-term impact, harmful impact on Montenegrin children. And for example, in 2020, before the pandemic, at risk of poverty rate in the country was 32%. And at the same time, 80% of children experience multiple deprivations. Actually one deprivation deprivation in at least one domain, and it was even more true for Roma and Egyptian children, where 96% of them experienced at least one deprivations, according to multidimensional poverty analysis that was done by UNICEF in 2021. During that time, as of the introduction of the law on social and child protection from 2013 until 2021, we had only vulnerability targeted benefit for children from families that received family support allowance and for children with disabilities. This implied really high exclusion errors because only 10% of children received child allowance, while the proportion of children at risk of poverty was 30% and even more. In 2021, we had this transition to age-limited quasi-universal child allowance for children up to 6 years of age. And then next year, 2022, we had full universal child allowance for children up to 18 years of age. And as you can see, in 2021, we already had a reduction of at risk of poverty rate to 30.5%, in 2022 to 28.4%, and in 2023 to 27.3%. So these are the latest data from the survey on income and living conditions, which is Statistical Agency of Montenegro. And according to the latest data that we received from the Line Ministry, the beneficiaries of the Universal Child Allowance in Montenegro in last year, 2024, were more than 97% of children. So it is more than 130,000 children. Also, in the next slide, you can see the overview of at risk of poverty rate and at risk of poverty or social exclusion rate and how it moved from regarding at risk of poverty rate from 33.7% in 2019 to 27.3% according to the latest data in 2023. So basically at risk of poverty rate fell by 6 percentage points, which is really huge success, and we can ascribe it to universal child allowance, though we do not have concrete evidence. And now we are planning to do an analysis which could clearly showcase the impact of universal child allowance, of course, analyzing the other factors that could contribute to a reduction of poverty among children as well. So now to the two questions. The first one that I would like to answer regards effective strategies in engaging parliamentarians and raising awareness on child poverty. The key in UNICEF's endeavors was the fact that there was a change of political landscape for the first time in Montenegro in several decades. So our country had elections in 2020, and in electoral campaign, the opposition focused their narrative on social justice and poverty due to the impact of the pandemic and economic crisis, rising public debt, etc. The opposition won, and at that time, a merged Ministry of Finance and Social Welfare was established. And this was really beneficial at that time because the decision on public finance and social protection was transferred to the same minister, who was really pro the introduction of the universal child allowance. Also, in 2021, the new government declared this year as a year of social justice. And this was really a rare opportunity to effect change and to make child poverty reduction a national issue and a priority. And UNICEF used this window of opportunity. The country office embarked on a joint work with young people, and we launched a campaign on child poverty reduction with the Parliament on 20th November 2022. This was the occasion of the World Children's Day, and the young reporters started the campaign by first asking the Parliament Speaker, Alex Bečić, to tell them in 1 minute how to reduce child poverty in Montenegro. So now I suggest to watch this video. It is on the next slide. And I will continue with my presentation afterwards.
Kako smanjiti siromaštvo djece u Crnoj Gori?
Nažalost, u Crnoj Gori imamo ne mali broj djece koja su u zoni siromaštva. Zato su budućnost mladih, nova radna mjesta, veće plate, penzije, socijalna davanja u vrhu naših prioriteta. Definitivno treba razmišljati o ponovnom uvođenju dječjeg dodatka. Hoćemo da u narednim godinama sva djeca u svim opštinama u Crnoj Gori imaju besplatne udžbenike. Hoćemo da sva djeca koja žele da se bave sportom imaju tu mogućnost, bez obzira na materijalni status njihovih roditelja. Hoćemo nagrade i stipendije za našu djecu i za naše đake. To je naš prioritet.
Okay, so you saw the video, and there were many like this that were made with the members of the parliament, but also with other prominent political figures and decision makers, also representatives of important national authorities, international organizations, etc. And they were all talking about their perception of poverty, about the manners that poverty can be reduced, and their proposed ideas. So this was followed by the introduction of the universal child allowance. And what is also important to say that apart from the introduction of the universal child allowance, also the already existing child allowance for children who receive family support allowance and children with disabilities was increased. So Montenegro actually has a combination of universal with targeted child allowance for the most vulnerable children. In the next slide, I would like to answer to the other question, how can other countries replicate Montenegro's approach to youth engagement? As I said, we relied on evidence like multidimensional poverty analysis. There was also the analysis of the social protection program, etc. So the most important piece of advice would be to engage in evidence generation activities in order to show the impact and also the cost-benefit analysis of the child benefit, because this is the most effective way to nudge the government to support the introduction of the program or to improve the existing program. Then, of course, to conduct active evidence dissemination all the time with national authorities, with every opportunity you get, and also to present a clear vision of short-term and long-term impact of the proposed scheme of the child allowance, and most importantly, how it can be achieved and how it can be monitored and measured, because this provides justified reasoning for introducing or expanding child benefits, to support the government's capacity to design, implement, monitor, and evaluate child benefit schemes, and also to always provide expert assistance in fiscal space analysis and expansion, which is the most important thing with the view of financial crisis. And as was the case in Montenegro, to use the temporary policy windows as they open. because this can considerably facilitate improving social protection schemes, because this creates more permissive policy space. So the gathered evidence combined with advocacy, with capacity buildings, would enable decision makers to increase their understanding of child poverty and also their understanding of improved coverage, adequacy, and sustainability of cash transfer programs. So the main point would be not to waste policy windows once they appear, and be prepared to act quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. This is useful, and indeed, policy window is quite important, an important driver. So let's move to our last case study before the Q&As. There's already Q&As in the chat. Please do encourage the speaker to respond and the participant to ask questions. Over to you, Elena. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon to all. Are you able to see my screen right, Dennis?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on the Panama experience to highlight the value of poverty measurement for advocacy and for policy planning. In Panama, strong and rigorous data has been key to elevate child poverty as a national priority, despite any political sensitivity that can exist around the topic. I'm going to start with a very brief context on how the Multidimensional Poverty Index was institutionalized as a routine official measurement, and then move on the process and the partnerships that led to using this measurement for planning the National Poverty Reduction Plan. I want to show this artificial intelligence image to highlight the disparities that Panama experienced. Panama is a high-income country. It's the third most unequal country in Latin America, though. 32% of children live in multidimensional poverty and 37.8% in monetary poverty. And poverty in Panama is highly territorial. It's mainly concentrated in indigenous territories. So the process with the Multidimensional Poverty Index started in 2017, when there was the launch of the General Multidimensional Poverty Measurement, and that was a stepping stone for the high-level decision to measure child multidimensional poverty specifically. And an intersectorial technical and advisory team was established. In 2018, consultations took place with over 700 children and adolescents nationwide to guide the selection and the prioritization of indicators within the technical team. And the multipurpose yearly survey was adapted to measure new child multidimensional poverty indicators. And later in this presentation, I'm going to highlight how embedding the poverty measure within an existing routine, existing survey was highly strategic. In 2018, the data was collected, calculations were conducted, and the measurement was launched. Very importantly, a national decree established mandatory routine measurement of child multidimensional poverty every 2 years. In 2020, the child multidimensional poverty measurement was used to prioritize children in the National Poverty Reduction Plan that was implemented from 2020 to 2024. And then in 2022, the data was collected for the second measurement, which was published in 2024. And the first 2018 and second 2022 child poverty measurement could have been used for policy evaluation pre and post, but Panama had a transition in national government in 2024, which led to an impasse in the aforementioned National Poverty Reduction Plan. So there is very high possibility that this policy is going to be discontinued without an evaluation using the poverty index as an outcome measure. Now I'm going to move into the partnerships and processes that bridge that gap between measurement and policy planning. The first one has to do with that intersectorial technical and advisory committee from the design phase that led to ownership of the measurement. The child multidimensional poverty measurement was led by the Social Cabinet Secretariat, which is intersectorial, naturally. It includes health, education, social protection, and others. And this led to appropriation not only by economy ministers or social development ministers, but by the whole governmental institutions. There was also strong and effective interagency coordination with UNDP, and that was highly strategic for going from measurement to policy planning, right? The second is that the fact that the measurement was institutionalized led to higher perceived utility of the longer term use they can do, right? So investing in advocating the institutionalization of the measurement will have a longer term impact and increase usability. And something that made this feasible was embedding the multidimensional poverty measurement, the SHA-1, in an already routine multi-purpose survey. And the third thing that really helped bridge the gap was all the investment that was done in the communication and the dissemination. So making noise with the data really helped put child poverty as a national priority and resulted in the inclusion in the National Poverty Reduction Plan. I want to finish with some lesson learned from this experience. In Panama, government priorities often change, so it's very important to continue advocating in the long term to ensure measurements remain on the top of the agenda. We could have stopped advocating for this measurement once it was institutionalized in 2019, but the fact is that unless stakeholders continue to prove its usefulness, then things can easily take a different route, right? Secondly, a child rights approach to poverty measurement is essential. The conversation on policy planning can be grounded then on poverty dimensions that directly tap into specific rights. And finally, well, a multidimensional measurement in contrast with an income-based measurement is highly strategic because it naturally engages various sectors in poverty reduction plan, education, health, social protection, beyond only economy and social development. Finally, some of the next steps we have in Panama, we are advocating for the third round of the Child Multidimensional Poverty Index with a focus on using it for longer-term policy evaluation. We, as Enrique mentioned, we are trying to use innovative approaches for poverty measurement through consensual approaches on the concept of relative deprivation, aim at finding a public consensus on what the necessities are, because this is particularly relevant for indigenous people. And thirdly, we are providing technical support to the government for the calculation and publication of a monetary childhood poverty measurement in small areas using census data. Many thanks, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Anna, and I guess you have shared your PowerPoint. Do share with us, please. So this is the end of the presentation, and it's the beginning of the question and answer with the panelists. So the floor is open to all participants. We want to hear from you if you have any question. Otherwise, we can have question among ourselves. There were a few questions in the chat. I can pick it up again. I think Enrique answered one question. Gonzalo, hello Gonzalo, you asked a question. I don't know if you want to come in, Gonzalo, and ask directly. Or you want me to read it? So what will be the
Danny?
Yeah? Yes.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I don't know if
Go ahead, Enrique. Hello? So any question? So Gonzalo asked whether there's the UNICEF role or will be the strategy to when there's a government that want to cancel an institution that is designed to measure poverty. I think there's a particular political context in Mexico that is not maybe favorable of this poverty agenda or discussion. I don't know what will be the role. I don't know if Jennifer can want to take it or Monica, she's not here. Enrique de la Monica, please come in.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was muted. I was going to mention that point by Gonzalo. It's a great question. It's a little bit difficult just for UNICEF to do that, but as part of the efforts that UNICEF makes, and I believe strongly that we should make more of these efforts at the country level, of strengthening statistical offices, but not just statistical offices, the whole statistical infrastructure in the country, because line ministries also have responsibilities in terms of measuring. There are subnational units, admin level 1, for example, where there are offices in charge of measuring things. Part of our efforts in strengthening them is to prevent this kind of problems, which unfortunately happen in many countries, not just in Mexico. It should not happen. The UNSD, the UN Statistical Division, has a whole set of manuals on qualitative statistics which explicitly address this issue. There should be no political interference with measurement. You know, when there are political changes or authoritarian regimes or whatever, there is so much that we can do. But I think all international agencies should make their voice heard that this type of manipulation of data should not happen anywhere. In these days and age of fake news, it's a little bit difficult, it's an uphill struggle, but we have to join forces to prevent these kind of abuses. Over.
Thank you, Enrique. Any other comment? We have been asked to share your Uganda report, Enrique, if you have it. You mentioned the Uganda example in your PowerPoint. If you have it.
Yes, I can certainly do that. It's available publicly.
Thank you. Browsing the question, so I'm waiting for. I don't see the hand. Somebody can help me, maybe. Huh? If there's any hand, just come in. I don't see any hand. Any question? So if there's no question, I'm waiting for the chat. I guess, gracias. I guess, well, yeah. So the political factor, the political, the national environment is a key driver for moving this work forward or slowing it down. I think we saw that in the example mentioned in Panama as well, and Montenegro. So colleague, I think the material will be available on our website. The report will be soon publicly available. I think it is actually. We're just waiting for the layout. There'll be some good practice note, more webinar to come. This is one good practice note on advocacy and measurement. There are more to come. A webinar in the next month or two. We're going to reach out again and to showcase the good work that is being done globally by UNICEF and its partner, not only UNICEF. Over to you, Enrique. I see you have a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Denny. Not the question. There was another question about political context, and you know, some of these things go above what we can do. But if poverty is too political and countries don't want to talk about poverty, as long as we measure it, we can do it and have either an internal dialogue within the government, not go public, or we can call it something else. You know, sometimes calling it deprivation, at risk of deprivation, or things like that work. I don't think we have to be shy or very conflicted about it. As long as we don't. As long as we do not measure something that is not poverty and we call it poverty, it's okay to measure poverty and call it something else depending on the political context. I would say, I mean, that would be my suggestion to countries, but I would like to hear maybe from other panelists if they think this is a useful approach. Over.
Thank you. This is something that came, I think, in the evolution as well. I see Anna. Of course, we're gonna Michael after that. Michael will do the closing remark. But Anna, I think you have a question.
But I had a question.
Thank you very much, Denny.
I'll jump in with a question before the closing remarks.
Yeah. Okay. So Anna first, and then you, Michael.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Denny. I just wanted to highlight one question that came up in the chat, and I think it was regarding children with disabilities. So I think the question was, what are the approaches that are useful for reducing poverty among this group? So maybe if any of the panelists can give any insight. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Two things, if I may, there.
Yes.
Can you
Yes,
hear me?
Enrique.
Yeah, two things. I put on the chat, I tried to put in the chat a report that cross-tabulates children with disabilities and children in poverty, which was done a couple of years ago. And also in our guidance, on the measurement guidance to country offices, we always tell country offices and statistical offices that they should measure if children that have functioning challenges and need assisted devices or special services, and those are material needs these children have, and if they are not satisfied, they should be measured as part of the material deprivations they suffer. Over.
Thank you. I think Michael has a question first, then I see Jennifer. I'm trying to be in logical order. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Denise. And I'll actually have a question for Jennifer as well. Just let me see if I can do Enrique, you made a really important remark about a comment about capacity within statistical agencies and really across government. And I think it's really helpful to get some concrete ideas here. When we teach courses on microsim and poverty measurement, we often ask, what is the easiest way to reduce poverty in your country? And someone always says, well, just lower the poverty line. It may seem an absurdly blunt answer, but given the problem with inflation over time and over time measuring repeated surveys, the need to adjust poverty measurement methodologies and adjust the poverty line, it happens more often, I think, than we want to admit that new poverty lines are really lower in real terms than the previous year's measurements that are being used. So what are concrete things UNICEF can do in countries to support better statistical infrastructure, particularly in the core ministries where UNICEF works and that need to use this evidence more effectively? And then a question to the whole panel, picking up on your last comment about using different terminology. There are two ways to proceed here. One is to use another term for poverty as a bad, and that is hardship in the Pacific, and it's deprivation in some countries. But the other idea is to focus on broadly improving material well-being, turning it from fighting a negative to promoting a positive, with the caveat that no one is left behind. And the reason this idea comes up is because the countries that are most reluctant to use the term poverty or to make it a national priority are the ones that need to do it the most. And part of it is because, particularly during the MDG era, a common advocacy tactic was to name and shame low MDG 1 performers. And I think many governments became fatigued with the shame, the failure, and reacted by a kind of denialism. And yet the term prosperity is popping up all over. And if we reframe some of our policy initiatives, I mean, we still measure poverty and we still identify how policies need to change, but is a framing on inclusive prosperity a better way to resonate with these key officials, in particularly the hard to impact countries, rather than the focus on poverty. And I want to ask the whole panel, Enrique, your perspective here would be really helpful, but Jennifer, I'd be really curious to get your thoughts and across the panel about how best to frame the efforts to tackle child poverty.
Thank you, Michael. Let's go first, maybe with Jennifer. Enrique, let you think about it, and ladies first, and then we'll go back to you.
And we put her on the spot. We don't give her time to think. So yes, that's right.
Fine,
No,
actually, because it's actually the point that I was going to come in on anyway. Maybe I'll say three things, right? One, which I think, you know, we all know, and I think it comes out clearly from some of the points in the evaluation, right? Talking about, let's say, talk about addressing child poverty and poverty in general, often is highly political, right? And that means actually better understanding the political economy, which I think is partly what you were getting at, Michael. And, you know, it's not only about specific countries, but it can also be about specific administrations and governments and what is the language that speaks to them. You know, and I know it varies quite a bit, but you know, we've seen some of these trends in some governments currently about what is, you know, there's partly what is acceptable to talk about, and that is definitely an issue in terms of some countries just don't want to talk about child poverty, but it's also what motivates policymakers, right, to actually make change. And like I said, that requires deeper political economy analysis. It's specific to context, but I think, you know, it's a bit what I was alluding to in terms of making our advocacy specific or tailored, right? And Michael, to your point, I think that there are different languages that work for different audiences, ranging from, I do think actually in some cases, not the naming and shaming, but I do think in some cases, like raising the alarm bell is actually something that is effective. And I think in others it's motivating, okay, these are national government priorities and positioning child poverty within that. But the other thing that I wanted to, so that was one point. I think the other thing that I wanted to mention, building on Enrique's point, is there can be a whole set of sensitivities around the measurement aspect, right? And sort of what do the numbers show? What do you call it? And, you know, Michael, I think you brought up this point now, and also in the evaluation, right? In different countries, we've used different languages to speak about those issues. We've called it different things. And, you know, we always have a bit of a debate internally, right? Because we're still a child rights organization. We want to bring that point forward. But I think, you know, sometimes that's a judgment call about making progress in child rights, even if we're not naming that as about child poverty. So there's some trade-offs there, to be frank. And we face them at different levels. But I think in these contexts where it's really sensitive to talk about the numbers around child poverty, I don't think that prevents us from doing work on the policy solutions, right? So I think in terms of doing that analysis about what policies in a particular context we think are going to make a big difference, and then maybe this goes to your point about shared prosperities, you know, in some cases it's talking about, you know, human capital or the youth dividend, right? There's different ways to sort of position those policies in a positive way for different audiences. I don't think we should also get caught in thinking, oh, we can't advance reducing child poverty if we can't talk about child poverty, right? I'm not saying that's an ideal situation. I still very much agree that we should be advocating from a child rights perspective, but I think sometimes we have to have these twin tracks in mind. Sorry, I know that's very high level, but, you know, if you look at specific, you know, country examples, you can see the ways in which that's been positioned. Actually, sorry, I'm going to add one last thing. Which links the presentation we heard from earlier from Montenegro, right? There's also the point about who do we partner with, right? And who can advocate and voice children's interests, whether that be civil society partners, you know, sometimes that's the Statistical Institute, right? It really depends. Or can it be young people themselves speaking up and trying to hold policymakers account, right? So there's different ways to wedge and push those issues forward. Thanks.
Thank you. I see Enrique concisely, please. Then I see Pedro, and for
yeah, I don't know, Pedro, you want to go first?
Pedro Esteban, if you just be concise, yeah. If it's a question or an answer, Pedro.
Yes, thank you. You allow me?
Yes, louder. Yeah, closer to the mic.
Yes, thank you. I just have one question, and I think it's for the EPRI colleagues. After your evaluation, after your report, I want to know if you found a country that would be an example for all of us in terms of the real shift that they managed to do after launching a specific child poverty measurement. I mean, we always talk about the importance of the influence, about the advocacy that we should do with the data after we finally won this specific battle of having a measurement on child poverty. But I don't know, I haven't found or I haven't reached to a country or municipality experience that show the real shift after and before and after a measurement. And I don't mean, I'm not thinking about the political discussion, saying now the government is speaking about child poverty, or the public, the news are understanding what is child poverty, but rather in programming, budgeting, designing specific policies, shifting institutional context, these big changes. I don't know, I haven't found a country, or at least I don't know, a good experience that could show the real importance and the real impact of having a measurement. But I don't know if the EPRI colleagues found it in the middle of all the evaluation and all the interviews that they did during the past 2 years. Thank you.
So if I can say, well, I would let
Yes.
other colleagues talk about other good examples. I think we had, if you hear Pedro, like the ones in Panama, Montenegro, but we have other examples, like, you know, I mentioned the one in Uganda, there is Tanzania, there are many other more. On the points you made, Jennifer, I completely agree. Michael, this you know, putting things in the positive is a good way. Another thing that we talked a little bit less today is some qualitative studies. There are countries, for example, in Lebanon, this was an issue. There was no survey, but they were able to do conversations with children and adolescents to raise some of these issues. That's also possible. But going positive or going with a measure which is positive, I think it's perfectly doable and advisable. In terms of helping countries not to cheat by changing the poverty lines or the thresholds, as I said earlier, that's a difficult challenge. The only thing we can do, together with other partners that work in the statistic, this is a statistical issue, right? So we have Paris 21, we have the World Bank, we have sometimes the Eurostat helping in some countries. We need to make sure that this does not happen. One way in which we do it for some of the child indicators, like in Latin America, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, we have working groups or expert groups on child statistics. We're setting up one for Africa now. The point about changing the poverty line, actually, I think it's even worse, because it's not just that countries try to lower the poverty line. Even if they stick to a poverty line for a long period of time, it becomes irrelevant. When there is economic growth and transformation in terms of new things that are becoming part of what a standard consumption package is, especially if a country grows fast for a decade or two, then that fixed poverty line becomes irrelevant. So actually they need to be updated, but they need to be updated upwards. The same thing with the thresholds for multidimensional poverty. Okay. For the international comparison, we say, oh, the child needs to have measles vaccine and DPT-3. That's nothing nowadays. Countries have to have much, much higher thresholds than those. Finally, I know we don't have a lot of time, Denny. One thing that we can do also is not to be fixated on the headcount number, not to be fixated either whether we use the monetary poverty line or a cutoff and we say at 1 or 2 dimensions the child is poor, but to show a range of situations. Children with no deprivation, children with 1, children with 2, children with 3, children with 4, children in households below the poverty line, below half of the poverty line. We need below 2 poverty lines. So we can do things like that. I know there are other things, other comments on the screen, on the chat. For MODA, the only thing I would say for now, maybe we can have a longer conversation and a write-up. The most important thing with MODA is not to fall into the trap of trying to put everything in it, including violence, life satisfaction, happiness, feeling secure, because then it becomes a quality of life measure, which is fine. If you want to do a quality of life measure, fine. Let's do a MODA to do a quality of life of children measure. But if you're measuring poverty, let's stick to poverty. And then it will be a very useful model. This is just to answer a question there by a colleague.
Thank you. Thank you, Enrique. Very useful. Maybe there's another one for you. We discussed yesterday, Enrique, in the chat from Paola about, I think it was satellite imagery or alternative data source. So we just need to move to the closing remark for sake of time for everybody. So I want to first to thank everybody, all the speaker and yourself, Enrique, but everybody, Jennifer, Michael, and Irena, Monica, and myself. And of course, let's move to the closing remark. More Celeste also put the in the chat the good practice note. There'll be, I said there's 4 of them, 3 or 4 of them, and the global report will be available where we also pick up more country case and show example and how the child driver. So over to you, Dr. Michael Samsung, a lead evaluator in this case and director of research for the EPRI Economic Policy Institute.
Thank you, Denis. And I want to thank all the panel and Denis, you in particular, for really motivating this whole webinar and getting it on the road. I'll just start by delegating one of my 3 minutes to Anna if she wants to jump in and share her thoughts. We were discussing on the chat the answer to Pedro's question, what would be some good examples? And Montenegro, Rwanda, Uganda in different ways. But if you want to come in for a minute, Anna, and just give your thoughts on an answer to that question, then I'll jump in for 2 more minutes.
Sure. Thank you very much, Michael, and to all the panelists. Thank you very much, Pedro, for your question. I think the point that you made is one of the critical findings that we have in the evaluation, and that's that sometimes it's harder to translate or to get the measurement to be used for actually making policy decisions. So that is well reflected in the report, and it's an area where UNICEF is encouraged to put more effort, right, and to find more avenues to use the measurements to inform policymaking, to guide policymaking. But then we would like to highlight the cases of Uganda, Rwanda, and of course Montenegro. I think Enrique, he spoke a bit about the Uganda case. I would like to highlight it as a particularly successful case where there was UNICEF promoted this buy-in with government partners, specifically by adopting or proposing a measurement approach that resonated more with the government from the beginning. And then this was useful for later kind of leveraging the measurement for guiding policy decisions. And then with I think the Rwanda case is also a very good example. This is highlighted in one of the good practice notes. I won't go through it because we don't have a lot of time, but you can see this in the good practice note. We'll paste the link shortly in the chat. And then of course, what Irina has presented about Montenegro, that's another very good example of how measurement has been supported and used to support.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Anna. And I just want to come back to 2 things. One, a key point Jennifer made, that speaking the language that resonates with policymakers is so critical in using this evidence for policy influencing. And that will be a different set of languages in varying contexts, but we want to validate the concerns of policymakers and make sure we're addressing their concerns even while we use the evidence effectively to tackle child poverty. And finally, I want to come back to a key point Enrique made, which I highlighted in my question, building the capacity to understand these statistics across government. And UNICEF has been particularly successful in building the capacity of key decision makers to understand this data, to understand these measurements, and to use them effectively. And I think between speaking the language and really making those connections and building the capacity, these have been critical ingredients in UNICEF's success with this agenda. Let me conclude. Thank you, all of you, for participating so actively and insightfully, and we'll look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, colleague and panelists. All the best and wonderful evening, afternoon, and morning. Thank you. Bye. Ciao.